the single most catastrophically imaginable event would be something between the U.S. and China. If you think of the U.S. as the guy in the circus keeping a lot of plates spinning simultaneously, together with allies and partners who help us in certain of these, and the plates represent threats, challenges, issues on which we need to take the lead, which we need to manage, et cetera. And there's more of those threats and challenges. There's more plates in that tent than at any time since certainly the end of the Cold War, if not the end of World War II. But the plate that represents the U.S. and Western relationship with China, that's bigger than all of the others put together. And we cannot let it even wobble.
General David Petraeus is a soldier scholar of extraordinary talent, four-star Army general, battlefield commander, West Point graduate, PhD from Princeton, author of books on warfare, creator of counterinsurgency strategies, and the surge in Iraq. He was famous for building relationships with local populations in war sites. After service in Iraq and Afghanistan, Petraeus became director of the CIA. He has held academic appointments at 6 universities. He is now an executive with the financial firm KKR. In 2023, Petraeus co-authored with historian Andrew Roberts Conflict, the Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Gaza. It is a moment to consider a changing world as wars in Iran and Ukraine continue. The two most powerful leaders in the world meet in May in Beijing, and the ongoing tension in different nations remains over cost of living issues. We will talk of many things, including the wars in Ukraine and Iran, the competition between China and the United States, the threat of Russia to Europe, the ambition of Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Benjamin Netanyahu, changes in how wars are engaged, the impact of technology, including artificial intelligence, and always the global economy and the cost of living. We will ask about qualities of leadership and the lessons of our time. General Petraeus, welcome back.
Good to be back, Charlie. Thanks.
I have in my hands something that you will recognize. It is the paperback of Conflict, the book that you wrote with Andrew Roberts, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Gaza. I want to start there because there are two hot wars still on, Iran and Ukraine. Where are they? What's happening?
Well, Ukraine, given that I'm a supporter of Ukraine and strongly believe that the kind of aggression that Russia has pursued should not be rewarded, is relatively heartening and encouraging because of the extraordinary innovation by Ukraine, by those who design the unmanned systems, those who manufacture them, and those who employ them, and the relationship among them, which enables constant improvements in software and hardware, and then the manufacturing capacity expansion. Ukraine now has an advantage over Russia on the front lines. It's no longer as important that they are outnumbered 5-1 by the Russians, heavily outgunned in, say, artillery and traditional fighting systems, because that's less relevant in an era in which right now the Ukrainians are inflicting over 90% of the casualties on the Russians with unmanned systems. Artillery can barely get in range now anymore because it's so threatened by this area. It's called the kill zone. It's at least 35 or so kilometers on either side of the front lines, which aren't lines anymore. There's no trenches because you can fly through trenches. There's not even fighting positions in the more rural areas because if you have a way to shoot out of a position, a drone can fly in. And so what's happened is the Ukrainians are now inflicting somewhere around 35,000 killed and seriously wounded on the Russians, which is just a little bit less than actually what the Russians are able to recruit in a given month. And that is a very, very significant achievement, as you would understand. Beyond that, the Ukrainians really are the ones exercising the most initiative on the front lines. They are actually achieving incremental gains, to be sure, but more incremental gains over the last 2 months than the Russians achieved. And there's the possibility that they could even craft a way of achieving greater gains if they can isolate certain areas of the battlefield, as they have done at least once in an area around Borova. Beyond that, they are now expanding the range of their drones so that they're getting into an area beyond the front lines, into the areas where the Russians in the past really weren't that threatened, and they can have their logistics trucks and resupply and all the rest of that go on without interdiction. And the Ukrainians are now interdicting that. They may, in fact, be able to isolate the entire Crimea Peninsula by threatening what goes across the Kerch Strait Bridge from Russia to Crimea, and then also interdicting the other route into Crimea, which comes from the north and from the southern part of Ukraine into northern Crimea. They're interdicting that route as well. And then finally, on a near nightly basis, they're carrying out very impressive attacks into the Russian Federation, hitting their oil depots, the storage locations, and also their refineries. At least 40% of those have now been hit. By no means all destroyed, but damage to at least 40 of those. And that shows continued expansion of that threat by the Ukrainians against the Russians. And of course, they're threatened right into Moscow itself, critical infrastructure. And very significantly, on the morning of the annual economic gathering that President Putin hosts in St. Petersburg, they actually blew up one of the storage locations there. It was quite a sight. It's on all the social media. And again, if you will, punctuated the beginning of that particular gathering. So all of a sudden, you're seeing the innovative capabilities of Ukraine manifest themselves in very heartening ways. And at the same time, you have the European Commission provide 90 billion euros to Ukraine that will probably solve their fiscal and economic challenges for at least a year and a half. The expansion of the production of drones from 3.5 million last year to 7 million this year, and advances already now in autonomous systems as well. So in that regard, that particular war has taken a turn for the better from the perspective of someone who strongly supports Ukraine, and again, very much does not want to see Russia prevail
So why doesn't Vladimir Putin sue for peace?
Well, he may actually do that. I think you can foresee a time where the cumulative effect, there's also, it's obviously has a huge drag in their economy. He's diverting the National Welfare Fund to be used by the military-industrial complex. And again, you can see a moment where he may need a cessation of hostilities as much as, or perhaps even more than, Ukraine does once the limits on oil exports are reimposed on Russia. We lifted those, perhaps understandably, about a worry about the price of Brent crude. So they're right now able to export much more oil than otherwise would be the case, and at a higher price, although the toll of the strikes on the Russian oil production, storage, and refineries has limited how much of the benefit they're able to gain from that. So you can see a moment where he may indeed have to do that. And I've actually I've argued that should be what we are all trying to achieve together as much as a year ago, when you could see various ways that we could help Ukraine. Ukraine will make advances on its own, just as we have, as I have just described, and could bring that moment, that possibility to reality.
My impression is that the Ukrainians offered this technology, drone technology, to President Trump, and he turned it down?
That's my understanding as well. And given how effective their counter drone technology is in particular, they're knocking down probably about 95% of the significant drone attacks. So there are these tactical attacks which are all up and down the battlefield. On a given day, there's probably 1,000 engagements by Ukrainian drones and the Russian, and not quite the same number in the other direction, but just vast quantities of drones at the tactical level. But what we're talking about here are the ones that are coming in the night, the improved version of what Iran provided to Russia, Shahed drones. They're faster. They have a bigger payload than what the Iranians have, and they are remotely piloted, which is something the Iranians don't have because they don't have that communications architecture or Starlink. They are taking down, again, about 95%. It's a combination of very sophisticated sensors, radars, and acoustic sensors integrated into a high-fidelity common air picture that all can see and operate on. And then electronic warfare, some very targeted guns, other systems, but a lot of it is drone interceptors, the vast majority. I went out on a mission with a drone intercept team back in early February on a frigid night outside Kyiv, and the skill of the pilots, the fidelity of the air picture, and the rest of that all put together is really almost breathtaking. Those systems have been offered and are being used in the Gulf states. President Zelensky wisely made a visit there after the war with Iran started, and it was clear that the Iranian drones were difficult for the Gulf states and for the U.S. to contend with. And they are working well, but you also are reminded that you need the other elements of the overarching, comprehensive, integrated ecosystem that enable the drone intercept teams. But I think it's something you've heard me before. I've said on your show before repeatedly that I felt that we should have learned much more rapidly and much more from what is going on in Ukraine. That is the future of war, not what's going on between Iran and the U.S. and the Gulf states and Israel in the Middle East. There are drones there, but the numbers are nothing like that. All of them put together wouldn't equal half of one day's use of drones by the Ukrainians. They're using over 10,000 drones per day now on the Ukrainian side, and it's increasing.
Is it fair to say that the future of warfare is changing in Ukraine today?
Very much so, and it has been really, Charlie. If you remember in the beginning, it was traditional combined arms warfare, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, air defense, all the other elements that make up combined arms warfare. And although it was stopped around Kyiv, it did make progress in other areas. And then, in fact, the Ukrainians using combined arms warfare retook a fair amount of ground in the fall of that first year. This second year offensive didn't go as well, but then now you've seen the introduction of unmanned systems, and that literally is changing warfare as we know it. Combined arms cannot survive. Tanks can't survive on this battlefield. As I said, artillery can barely get in range in the death zone before they have to get back out or get under cover. So it really is almost all unmanned systems, although in urban settings, there are still a lot of direct fire engagements because it's more difficult, obviously, for drones to get in and operate. But in the more open, more rural areas, again, it's very, very hard for anything, including a soldier, to survive outside.
Is unmanned what we call autonomous?
Not yet. No, right now, the state of the art is largely remotely piloted unmanned systems. But you can see already the beginning of the introduction of what we will call autonomous systems. So these are systems. Right now, they can finish an engagement, let's say. So if the pilot gets a lock on a particular, say, a Russian drone, they can intercept it the rest of the way on their own if that's necessary. There are some other systems that can also, if the command and control link is broken, can carry on the mission, but based on the algorithm that is on board. But within a year, maybe even less, we're going to see the introduction of sizable numbers of Ukrainian drones that have onboard computer capability. In other words, and it's an algorithm that has been programmed, and it will give the direction to the drone, and you won't require a remote pilot anymore. And that is very, very significant, because then you can see the advent of swarms of drones, many, many dozens or more of drones simultaneously coming at a target. And we really don't have a defense for that right now. All of the counter drone systems right now are largely individual. It's a gun taking down one, it's an interceptor taking down another. Electronic warfare can get some, or at least break the link, but now that won't be effective. By the way, we're seeing something in southern Lebanon that's proving very challenging for the Israeli Defense Forces, and that is first-person view. So you have a goggles on, and you're flying it, and you're seeing what the drone sees. And these are often the suicide drones; they're one-way attack drones, but they have fiber optic cable spooling out the back, and you obviously can't jam the command and control link then. And that's a real challenge. It's also a challenge on the battlefield in Ukraine. I
assume it came from the Iranians.
Absolutely, yes. I'm pretty sure those were provided by the Iranians. And again, it's not a capability Iran has been able to use in the war on the Gulf states or U.S. or Israeli targets, because the range is too far for that kind of fiber optic cable. It's probably best around 30 kilometers, maybe a bit longer than that. But obviously the targets in Israel or in southern Lebanon are well within range of that. And you've seen real problems for the Israelis in that regard.
Are they finding themselves more vulnerable than they imagined?
I honestly don't know. I have not talked to them in recent months about what they expected. This does seem to be a bit unexpected, though, because in some cases they've not been able to deal with them. And again, you've got to have a layered defense system. And in this case, it's going to have to be guns, or there's various options that you have. You can even the Ukrainians use drones with shotguns on them, because again, the area, the pellets can take down a drone. You really need every possible and conceivable counter for this kind of warfare until we get to, say, high-powered microwave, which is coming, but it has a short range. It's only 2 to 3 kilometers. So it's really a point defense system rather than an area defense, which is what most of the longer range air and ballistic missile defenses are.
So the question is, if the United States becomes urgent about this, how long would it take this country to catch up?
Well, first, what we should do, and I think this is now taking place, Charlie. I mean, there's a huge sprint. There's $55 billion in the defense budget just for the purchase of unmanned and autonomous systems. That's a huge quantity of money. That's many, many times order of magnitude what the entire cost of the production of the Ukrainian systems is, noting that they're very, very cheap, but also very, very effective, in part because labor costs are very low in Ukraine. But so there's a lot of learning now going on from Ukraine. There are some systems made in Ukraine that are now made in U.S., Poland, and Taiwan. Eric Schmidt's system is among those. But the key is to get it onto the battlefield in Ukraine, because that is the state of the art across the board when it comes to unmanned systems warfare. So we can do that. But unfortunately, we were slow. The systems we introduced early in the war that were so exquisitely capable for the first few months, or maybe even half a year they were there, the Russians developed counters. So it's constant back and forth. And what a country needs to do now is not only have a sizable magazine, if you will, of systems to use in the early weeks or months of a war, but if it's going to drag on for a period of time, you've got to have agility in your manufacturing so that you can make the software and hardware changes necessary to contend with the counters that are developed by the adversary.
So what's happening in the Iran war?
Well, we are in a little bit of a strategic cul-de-sac right now. And by that, I mean that any route out of this has at least potential downsides. I think when we were last together, I observed that it's paradoxical, but possible that Iran could emerge from this war quite weakened militarily, quite degraded militarily. Again, the 20,000 or so individual strikes have taken an enormous toll on Iran's military capabilities, though they still clearly do have drones and missiles, enough to cause problems for our bases, the Gulf states, and Israeli targets.
And fast boats on the Strait of Hormuz.
The fast boats have been problematic. All the rest of their Navy has been sunk. But there still are these capabilities that are problematic. And again, the use of drones, fast boats with heavy machine guns and so forth. And the challenge is, how can a deal be crafted that returns freedom of navigation to the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz without Iran having some kind of authority to charge tolls or navigation fees, whatever the title might be. And by the way, they're even now looking at imposing that on the cables that go along the bottom of the floor that carry data and so forth. How do we get that agreement? And then also, though, subsequently get agreement on the 1,000 pounds of 60% enriched uranium that's presumably buried under the rubble of one or more of the destroyed nuclear facilities of Iran. What do you do with the medium enriched uranium? Is there a right to enrich uranium for Iran in the future? What about Iran's support of proxies? And of course, on our side, we're going to have to agree to lift some or all of the sanctions on Iran, lift our blockade on their blockade, which prevents ships from going into or out of their ports, which dramatically, obviously, degrades their economy. But it appears that the Iranians sense that President Trump has less staying power, if you will, than they do, because they're not facing midterm elections. They're not worried about an affordability agenda. They're not worried about losing the House. All of these concerns that are legitimate, real, and concerning, understandably, for the administration. And so this is the challenge. How do you get out of this situation without some long-term undesirable element being present?
Well, it is said that the present regime, after those who were killed in the airstrikes, is tougher, more rigid than the previous regime.
That is the assessment. Keep in mind that the new supreme leader is, of course, the son of the old supreme leader.
And we don't know what condition he's in.
We don't. The new supreme leader was wounded in the strike that initiated the campaign against Iran, that killed his father, his mother, and his wife, and again, seriously wounded him. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps leadership appears to be the center of the new leadership, together with the supreme leader, and he was always close to the IRGC. And again, they seem to be willing to tough it out longer. And of course, if their people don't like it and come out on the streets and demonstrate, the Iranians know what to do about that. They have
what you have just described. What you have just described is a circumstance in which apparently the American president is more anxious for an agreement than the regime in Iran.
I think that is a correct assessment, and I think it is their assessment. And, the signals that have been sent, despite sometimes, saying the opposite of what appears to be the case, it appears that, again, the president very much needs this deal. His party is anxious about getting it. Obviously, the inflationary effects will accumulate more over time. And there's an awareness, reportedly, by the administration that come 1 July, if the strait hasn't been reopened and is really functioning again, that's when you see the real issues set in with respect to the reduction in the global supply of crude oil and LNG, to the point that some countries then will have to pursue what are called demand destruction policies. In other words, saying, don't come to the office 2 or 3 days a week because we want to save the fuel that would be required for transportation.
Suppose there was an agreement tomorrow. How long would it take for there to be the kind of flow that would have an impact on oil prices?
Well, if there was an agreement, prices would come down pretty quickly.
In anticipation of where they might be.
Because again, keep in mind, these are prices of the future of
Exactly.
crude oil. So again, Brent crude, West Texas Intermediate. But again, it will take weeks, months, depending on the level of confidence of those who own these ships and the cargo on them. When
and
I
the
talk
insurance
to
company that's protecting them.
Because again, it was explained to me by the CEOs of the 2 largest energy companies in the world that this is not about the cost of risk insurance. This is about lives of crews. And until they're absolutely confident, they're not going to begin the full transit that we need to see again. So, but it will then, regardless, it's going, because again, the strategic reserve releases, they have largely been completed around the world. There's the reserves in various locations, including the United States, I'm told, are the lowest in quite a very long time. And even though some oil is still getting out, the Saudis are able to send as much as 7.5 million barrels a day out through the Red Sea, the port of Yanbu. Emiratis can get 1.5 million out of the port they have on the Gulf of Oman at Fujairah. Nonetheless, now the cumulative effect of the reduction in supply of crude and LNG and then all these other products, Charlie. Again, fertilizer, many countries have already missed having the fertilizer they needed for the planting season, and on and on. Helium, of all things, this big source of helium is the Gulf states. That's what's used in the process, I believe, of etching microchips. And it just is not available elsewhere. So there's a lot of, beyond just oil, gas, products of oil and gas, even other commodities and goods and services that come out of the Gulf states have been very, very heavily affected. By the way, there's huge implications for the Gulf states out of this. I've been out there twice just in the last 8 weeks or so, and it is very clear they are already beginning the execution of actions to increase resilience in the future, harden, reduce single points of failure, so increase redundancy, take it underground, new building codes, not just as well as the purchase of more and more comprehensive defenses and probably retaliatory capabilities, but also initiatives to reduce the dependence on the Strait of Hormuz. So you'll see, in fact, the Emiratis already have a second pipeline that's nearly done to Fujairah. You'll see other countries like Qatar, which, by the way, lost 17% of its LNG capacity to an Iranian strike for 3 to 5 years. That's out. They're going to have to run a pipeline, very likely, through Saudi Arabia and then down to Oman to have an alternative route out. And by the way, they just don't run a pipeline. They then have to have a liquefaction plant at the end of it at the port in order to load LNG onto these huge LNG carriers. But there's going to be innumerable initiatives like that. And there will be countries that really benefit from this. Oman, I think, will be one of them. And there may be some in the Gulf where, again, they were hoping to get a much bigger piece of the so-called India, Mideast, Europe corridor effort that is ongoing may not benefit quite as much from that.
Did I read somewhere that the Iranians have hit the UAE more than they have hit Israel?
With drones, that's likely.
Yes.
Yes, I think they've been hit more than all the other Gulf states put
That's what I
together,
thought.
and I think more than the Israeli Defense Forces as well.
You served as the director of the CIA. You love the CIA. Were they aware of what the Iranians might do, and did they advise the president? And was he clearly aware that this was a possibility?
Yeah, my understanding is that the answer to that is yes. And in fact, it is publicly known, it's been reported that the senior director for Iran for the National Security Council staff quit, partly because he didn't feel that people were listening sufficiently. At least that is what has been reported. Look, I mean, we've always known that one of the reactions by the Iranians to this kind of campaign would be to close the Strait of Hormuz. Sometimes that's dismissed a bit because it would mean that they would suffer pain as well. Although keep in mind that their ships were still going out of the Gulf until we put the blockade on them, on the transit into and out of their ports. So again, it's always been there. The question is, how carefully did people listen to it? Did they take it seriously or tend to dismiss it? And those questions I obviously just don't know.
I mean, the other part of that question is the Iranians, were they aware of what a powerful weapon it was to have control over the Strait of Hormuz? Some are even saying it's more important than having a nuclear weapon.
It will have potentially a significant deterrent power in the future, in the way that threatening to use a nuclear weapon might as well. Although we've seen, obviously, a number of wars over the years, which include participants that have nuclear weapons, where the war takes place below the nuclear threshold, including the war in Ukraine. And although Putin threatened at various times to use tactical nuclear weapons, the minute that President Xi of China and Prime Minister Modi of India publicly said he shouldn't even think about that threat, I think, really was enormously reduced. So this threat to close the strait when reopened could be something that gives a degree of leverage to Iran. But of course, you have to see what the condition of Iran is at that point in time as well. I mean, their unemployment as a result of this has been staggering. They also have massive problems already with mismanagement of water, to the point that they were considering telling 2 or 3 million people to leave Tehran because they can't provide them with water. They have so many challenges, many before this started, and yet they do seem to have a degree of resilience that is less manifest in, say, arguably the United States.
Do we know who's running Iran?
The thinking, Charlie, is that it is the leader of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps with the supreme leader. Not clear who is the primary and who is the not primary in this case. But it is very clearly the IRGC that has moved into the most significant role, and together again with this new supreme leader.
Are the clerics still a power base?
Yes, they are. But again, the IRGC more so now, I would contend, than the clerical side of things, noting that, of course, the supreme leader is a cleric.
Is the United States strategically overextended?
I don't know that I would say that, Charlie. I mean, what is clear, because again, we're not engaged in the war in Ukraine. We have been supporting it pretty substantially, but the Europeans have very much stepped up in that regard as we have drawn back. And, we have a modest number of forces in the Gulf. Yes, to be sure, there's a very substantial part of our aircraft carrier task force uh, assets and some other very select assets. But it's again, look, when I was commanding Central Command, Charlie, we had 250,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and another 250,000 contractors, which is many, many orders of magnitude larger than what we have out there right now.
How about our stockpile of weapons?
That's what I was just about to say. What we have done is used up a substantial proportion of our most high-end ballistic missile interceptors, Patriot, SM-203, the ship-borne version, and a very substantial number of our most exquisite submarine-launched, ship-launched, and air-launched cruise missiles, among others. So there is a huge effort ongoing in the defense industry. Remember, President Trump rightly called all the major corporation leaders together at the White House, talked about the need to dramatically increase production of these systems. There will be huge sums in the defense budget for this. That together with the purchase, again, of huge numbers of unmanned systems, some remotely piloted, some autonomous. So again, and some of that would be very, very valuable in a contingency in the Indo-Pacific, keeping in mind that the most important mission of the U.S. military, together with our allies in Japan, Philippines, Australia, is to ensure deterrence is solid in that region. And deterrence rests on two elements, of course. It's the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to use them on the other. And obviously, our capabilities in certain of these categories have been reduced, although our leadership has reassured us that we have enough to do what we need to do out there. But again, you always want to have more, needless to say. And then there's a little bit of concern about the statement by the president on the plane on the way home from the summit with President Xi, which indicated that the pending arms sale, huge arms sale to Taiwan, might be used as a bargaining chip in some fashion. Now, understandable.
Which is a break with tradition of every previous president.
Yes. And again, this is always a very tricky, very sensitive subject, needless to say, because we have a policy deliberately of strategic ambiguity.
Right.
But you'll recall that President Biden, for example, on 4 occasions said, of course, we'll support Taiwan. And then Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, would rush out and say there's no policy to our policy of strategic ambiguity and our commitment to the Taiwan Relations Act and this, and this. So we have to be very careful there. And I think that there is that sensitivity to that. But again, given the elements on which deterrence rests, we also need to transform our capabilities more rapidly in light of what has happened in Ukraine, in light of what has happened in the Gulf as well.
Is it possible that she looked at what happened in Ukraine, what you described early in this conversation, and says, I'm not so sure I want to rush into Taiwan?
I think that could be one possibility. It depends, though, I think, on how much the Chinese have been acting on the lessons of Ukraine. Keeping in mind that, again, the overall lesson is that a massive number of small unmanned systems can cause massive problems for a small number of large platforms, heavily manned, exquisitely capable, but getting pushed further and further back, say in the Pacific. If they have acted on this aggressively, that could give a degree of confidence, depending, of course, what's going on in Taiwan, what's going on in the region. The manufacturing capacities of China certainly would indicate that they could act on this kind of insight. They have been supporting Russia very aggressively with the components needed for its military industrial complex. But on the other hand, Charlie, keep in mind that the Chinese military hasn't even fought, hasn't even been in war since 1979, and that didn't go that well against Vietnam, the newly independent Vietnam. And beyond that, they've just gone through a period in which almost all of their senior leaders have been fired. A very substantial number of
Do
the
we know
most.
why they were fired?
It appears to be a combination of factors, Charlie. Concern about corruption, which has just been endemic, of course, in a variety of different ways throughout the system, and malfeasance, and then also perhaps some indicators of a degree of lack of complete loyalty. And of course, what President Xi has done more than any Chinese leader since Mao, at least, has been to consolidate power in an unprecedented manner. The elements of other factions within the Chinese Communist Party have all been eliminated. The most unceremonious was one of his predecessors was ushered off the stage at the big gathering in Beijing. So it's a number of all of the above. But what that means is that you have new leaders who have not been in their positions that long. There's a reintroduction of the party influence in a way that they haven't had for some time. And it has to give question. It has to generate worries, I would think, about how it would perform. And of course, they still even haven't fully consolidated their Goldwater-Nichols reforms, if you will. In other words, going joint, creating different command structures, regional commands, and so forth, along the lines of what we did all the way back before Operation Desert Storm, a number of decades ago.
Xi Jinping also early on mentioned the Thucydides trap. Explain to us what that is and why it's his sense of the moment in the relationship between America and China.
Yeah, the Thucydides trap really comes from Graham Allison's
professor at Harvard.
Yeah, professor at Harvard, and big mentor, frankly, of mine and friend and so forth. The Chinese leaders were very much seized by this book. And Graham Allison has made a number of trips over there. The title of the book was Destined for War, without a question mark. Can China and the United States avoid the Thucydides trap, which again refers back to a time in the Peloponnesian Wars when the rise of Athens as a power threatened the existing power, Sparta, and they went to war. It was inevitably, they fought that, again, there had to be action taken against this rising power before it got so big that the existing power could no longer deal with it. And of course, there were, I think it was 15 different historical case studies of previous examples to buttress the argument that he had. Although, to be fair, none of those were in the nuclear age and some other modern developments that might call that particular historical inquiry a bit into question. But the bottom line is that he raised it, and he's aware of it. And he's aware of the dynamics between the rising power, in this case, China, the existing power, the United States. And look, we do need to be concerned. Obviously, the worst development in the world for the economy would be for the number one and two economies of the world to go to war. We have to ensure that crisis doesn't turn into actual conflict. And that's why, frankly, the kinds of summits, the one that was held in December in Busan, Korea, the one that was just held in Beijing, are very important. We do need to talk. Yes, this is a fierce competition, severe competition, actually, in the words of Jake Sullivan, the former national security advisor. But we have to make sure that competition, again, doesn't ever erupt into actual conflict. In my view, the way to do that is to ensure that the elements of deterrence are rock solid, noting that we should never do something that is needlessly provocative. But it's a very, very sensitive relationship and issue. Talking is good, even though, frankly, the most recent of those summits did not result in anything particularly hugely significant. The really big issue, the U.S. access to strategic minerals, has not yet been resolved beyond the agreement that lapses in November. Yes, they're going to buy some more Boeing aircraft, some of our agricultural products. We have not really resolved whether we'll allow access to the most high-end chips. So the big issues in the relationship are still to be resolved, but there will be another summit here in the United States in the months that lie ahead.
The reason that I asked this question is clearly whether Xi Jinping sees China at a state of parity with the United States. And secondly, is there any possibility of miscalculation on either part, on the part of the United States or on the part of China, of each other?
Well, there's always that possibility, Charlie. I don't think on the U.S. side that it would lead to conflict. But certainly it's possible, especially, again, with the rising power that believes that it has actually achieved advantages. Again, it has oligopolistic or monopolistic power over some critical sectors of the global economy: strategics, rare earth minerals, magnets. Remember when the response by China to the 156% tariffs was, okay, we're going to stop the sale of magnets. The automakers all came to Washington in a panic and said, without magnets, we can't make cars.
I know. It shows you how stupid I am mechanically. I had no idea that they use magnets in cars.
Welcome to the 21st century, Charlie. But also the same is true of a variety of other elements that we buy from China, including much of the battery technology, solar panels. Again, you name it. There are numerous areas in which they have gained enormous leverage over sectors, including, again, in some cases, arguably monopolistic, if not oligopolistic power.
Which leads me to the so-called race of artificial intelligence and how the Chinese and the Americans may be approaching it differently in terms of what they emphasize and in terms of the direction they're taking.
Well, I think as a general assessment, it's correct to observe that the U.S. is a generation ahead of China when it comes to artificial intelligence, large language model power. But then you have to remind yourself that a generation in AI could be as little as 9 months or even less. In fact, when I asked the leadership of Anthropic at the Aspen Ideas, at a small gathering during the Aspen Ideas Festival last summer, I asked them to give me in layman's terms where we are with LLMs. And they said, well, the current large language model is about the level of a great graduate student. But within 9 to 12 months, it will be at the level of a great PhD. And 9 months or so from there, it'll be at the level of a Nobel laureate. Well, they're already at the level of a great PhD. All of them generally are. You know, Claude, the latest version, is really extraordinary. The same is true of the other LLMs that are comparable. And in fact, Anthropic had Mythos, which is this unbelievably powerful AI LLM that can find zero-day deficiencies that eluded human exploration for them for decades.
So you could break down the security system that powerhouses had of all kinds of systems that perform essential functions in the daily life of Americans.
it's another tool to do that. Again, there are various other capabilities, obviously, already in existence. This puts that on steroids. And oh, by the way, wait until we get quantum computing or even near quantum, when you can crack something that is encoded, that is encrypted, and you can crack that in a matter of hours or perhaps even minutes, when it used to take by brute force many, many months and all the capacity that, say, the National Security Agency or some other comparable organization could provide.
So tell me this. Do you fear nuclear more, or how would he rank them? Nuclear, biology, climate, or technology?
Well, I think the breakthroughs in technology are going to be extraordinary. Again, 9 months or less from now, we're going to see LLMs that have the power of a Nobel laureate. There still will be obviously certain capabilities that only humans truly have. Fareed Zakaria gave a great speech on this in one of his commencement addresses.
At Bard College.
Yes, exactly. Noting that, of course, when he mentioned AI, of course, the groans and jeers went up.
What Fareed did is he talked about human intelligence, not artificial intelligence.
That's exactly right. Although he had to say artificial intelligence first and then get the booze out of the way.
That's
and now
right.
let's talk about AI,
which is
AI.
A reference to the fact that whenever anybody mentions artificial intelligence, or not everybody, when they mention artificial intelligence in commencement addresses, the students boo them.
Yes, exactly right. Yep. So obviously that's a concern. I mean, nuclear weapons, we have managed to live with those since the actual only uses in warfare, which of course brought to a close the Pacific theater in World War II when the U.S. used them on Japan. The biological is also very, very worrisome.
I mean, Ebola is now back.
Exactly, right. And it seems to have a strain that's less susceptible to the existing drugs and so forth. So how do you choose between these, Charlie? I'm just not sure how you do that. I think,
and we can all see the impact of climate.
And you see that as well. That is increasingly evident, but it will take longer. I mean, I think the cataclysmic event that could result from these other three in the near term, unless you're in the eye of a hurricane or something like that, that is much more frequent now than it used to be. The storm of the century is now every other year. But all of these are, again, hugely worrisome. And of course, in some cases, we have yet to determine whether and how we should regulate. There are certain regimes that we have had, at least when it came to nuclear weapons, although some of these are gone, to be sure, the arms limitations talks and so forth. But we're still in early days with AI, and nobody wants to lose the AI edge, so we don't want to overregulate it. And yet, who knows where that leaves us? So, look, Charlie, there's a lot of things about which we all should be worried. Some we should worry about more when we reach our station in life than others. But I think everyone has to keep that in perspective.
I take no pride in this question because I'm stealing left and right. What is it you worry about in the middle of the night when you wake up?
I think it comes back to it's all China all the time. Again, the single most catastrophically imaginable event would be something between the U.S. and China. If you think of the U.S. as the guy in the circus keeping a lot of plates spinning simultaneously, together with allies and partners who help us in certain of these, and the plates represent threats, challenges, issues on which we need to take the lead, which we need to manage, et cetera. And there's more of those threats and challenges. There's more plates in that tent than at any time since certainly the end of the Cold War, if not the end of World War II. But the plate that represents the U.S. and Western relationship with China, that's bigger than all of the others put together. And we cannot let it even wobble.
What do you think Xi Jinping, what's his goal? Obviously, it's Taiwan.
Well, he wants reunification. It's his last bucket list item. And what we need to do is make sure that every morning when he gets up in Beijing and looks wistfully out there and says, I dealt with Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, Xinjiang, Tibet, but that's my last goal, that he concludes not today. And that's what we need to do with deterrence. And it's the most important mission of our U.S. military.
And if you were giving advice to the president, the Secretary of Defense, what would you be advising them?
Well, first and foremost is to make sure that the elements of deterrence there are rock solid. Part of ensuring that is to learn much more rapidly and much more from what is going on in Ukraine, and to try to be at the cutting edge of those developments, just as is Ukraine, with all of the capacity that we can bring to bear.
Thank you so much. It's all a pleasure. And I have a 1,000 other questions. I appreciate your time.
And we'll do it again, Charlie. Always great to be with you. Thank you.
Bye.
Join me, become a subscriber to Charlie Rose Global Conversations, and make it a better experience. Click this link to subscribe.